You know, they like to call it natural gas as if it's something you buy in Whole Foods. It's not. It's a dangerous, toxic, poisonous, carcinogenic substance. The whole point of it is to burn it. To wrap that all up, you've got the leak on the front end when you're fracking, the leak through the pipes, the burning of the compressors to power the compressor station. The possibility of happening to these pipelines would happen in Appomattox, Virginia, absolute explosion. And then you've got the methane being burned at the end.
Hey, you're the attorney, correct? Cool. What's your name?
Jonathan Sokolow.
And what was interesting, what you were saying was the methane and all these chemicals and that kind of go beyond just the normal. Can you kind of tell the audience again, go in depth, like what are the things being burned for this pipeline in particular?
Well, what's being burned is methane, so you have to look at the entire infrastructure. So we talked a lot about pipelines today, but the process starts with the fracking in West Virginia and Pennsylvania predominantly, where they're putting chemical water, actually fracturing the rock to release the methane. The chemicals are the companies that are doing the fracking consider those chemicals that they're using proprietary. They don't even tell us what chemicals are, but they're polluting the water on the front end there. Methane leaks as part of that whole process. And then you have the rest of the project, which includes the pipelines, which also leak, sometimes explode. And then at the very end, the whole purpose of getting the methane out of the ground is to burn it to create electricity. So, and when you burn methane, it causes greenhouse gases. It's actually much more powerful than carbon dioxide. So they like to call it a clean alternative to coal. It's exactly the opposite. It has a much worse effect in terms of greenhouse gases. Plus, when you burn it, it releases all sorts of toxins. So you're burning methane, you have benzene that gets into the air, particulate matter, other toxic chemicals that get in people's lungs if you have asthma, COPD or other respiratory diseases. It's going to aggravate that. So we're talking about air pollution. It's not just water pollution, it's air pollution as well.
You know what, really, you look at FERC, a lot of people don't know the process, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It seems like they're granting, the permit or whatever the pipeline to go forward, and then you get eminent domain from the courts without there's not all the other permits have not been distributed yet.
That's correct.
So how is it can you explain the process? Because, I mean, people's land and their trees are being cut down. I just did a report from their property, and the deforestation is incredibly devastating, yet all the permits aren't even through.
Right, so they have the process sort of split up into a lot of different segments, which is what allows it to happen. So if FERC approves it, they give a notice to proceed, they get permission for tree cutting, they authorize eminent domain, the use of eminent domain. The companies then go to the landowners to try to negotiate voluntary eminent domain, pay them for the privilege of destroying their land. If the people don't agree to whatever proposal the pipeline company makes, then they sue them in federal court. That's what happened to the Terrys. That was the whole process. They lost. The Terrys lost in federal court on eminent domain. The pipeline company was given the right to use their property as an easement, which is why the Terrys went into the trees. They ended up coming out of the trees because the same federal court judge who granted the eminent domain easement said they were going to be held in contempt unless they got out of the trees by midnight on Saturday, which is why they came out Saturday afternoon.
Just for the common person, like my understanding of eminent domain was for like highways and schools and things that actually help like a wide population. How did pipelines become this thing of eminent domain? Because it's happening everywhere.
Well, it's a very good question. So, I mean, eminent domain has been around as long as our country's been around. The whole idea is that even though people own the land, ultimately it used to be the king, but now the government has certain rights to the land if it's in the public good. And for many years, public good was defined as something that, as you said, for creating highways. That the state highway system is a perfect example of something that everybody would agree is a public good. Telephone wires. The Terrys in particular granted an easement to have telephone wires put in and electrical wires put in Bent Mountain many years ago. They're not opposed to domain for the public good. They actually allowed that to happen so the 500 residents on Bent Mountain could get telephone service, could get electricity. But what's happened, excuse me, is that that's morphed into allowing eminent domain for all sorts of private uses. What happened in the case of the Mountain Valley and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, it's also happened with other pipelines, is companies like Dominion create subsidiaries, which are shell companies. They sign agreements with them, and then they go to FERC and they say, public need for this. How do we know there's a public need? Because this company has offered to buy the gas.
The LLCs they create.
That's great, and they're all wholly owned subsidiaries of Dominion, or in the case of Mountain Valley Pipeline, of EQT and its partners. So they create this fiction that there's an actual need. They go to FERC and say that there's a public need. Excuse me. And in the case of these two pipelines, as I mentioned earlier, the pipelines were approved by FERC by a 2-to-1 vote. The two Trump appointees voting in favor, the one Obama appointee voting against, Cheryl LaFleur, in which she said there is no public good here. And what's more, we shouldn't be approving any kind of pipeline based on these subsidiary agreements because it creates a fiction that there's even a need for the pipelines.
And it's my understanding, I could be wrong, but from what I've read, FERC has not rejected pipelines since like the 80s.
Yeah, the passage rate is roughly 98%, and it's almost always unanimous. That's why in the case of these two pipelines in Virginia, it was so extraordinary that there was a dissent. They issued the opinion at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. Tim Kaine came out the next day and said that these were very suspicious circumstances under which they were approved. He said there is no public need for these, and he says anytime a body such as FERC issues something on a late Friday night, they're doing it because they can't defend the reasoning. And I think that was the case in the case of these two pipelines.
And the compressor station you were talking about, a predominantly black neighborhood. Obviously, you know, we've seen, I was in East Chicago, Indiana. There's a lead crisis there. They basically built low-income housing on top of a lead smelting plant. So we see this in other communities, but this compressor station sounds like it's very, very dangerous to any community, much less a predominantly black community.
Yeah, the story of Union Hill is really an atrocity in the making. This is a community that was founded by freed slaves before the Civil War. Freedmen continued afterwards. The residents there are 85% African American, many of whom are descendants from the slaves who worked the plantations there. The name of the plantation there was called Variety Shade. It was a huge plantation in Buckingham County. The land that was purchased to build the compressor station was purchased by Dominion Energy for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline from Variety Shade, which is a trust created by the descendants of slave owners who owned the descendants of the people who now live there. I mean, it's just as stark as it can be. And these people live within a mile. 85% of the people within a mile of the compressor station are African American. They've got the methane that's going to be burned at this compressor station. And just so people understand, this isn't just some small compressor station you may see in suburbia somewhere, because those things are built every 40 to 60 miles. You're talking about a compressor station that's covering 300 miles of pipeline. It's massive. I think it's 57,000 horsepower. It's really unprecedented. And it's going to be running 24/7. It creates noise. It creates vibration. Their actual planned burning of methane to release some pressure. That's part of what compressor stations do, so that's going to release all these toxins in the air. There's leakages that can happen. They actually burn the methane deliberately, not only to release pressure, but to generate the power for the compressor station. So it's just terrible. And to sort of put the exclamation point on it, there's two African American churches, Baptist churches, within a mile of the compressor station that have been there since the Civil War. One of them started as an arbor church, which was an outdoor church that was used by African Americans in days of slavery to worship outside. That was where they were allowed. That was the only place they were allowed to worship. And one of those churches within a mile of the compressor station was formed as this arbor. So it can't get any starker than that. The state can put a stop to that. The county can put a stop to it. They need an air permit in order to build that compressor station. Buckingham County has to issue that air permit. They have not done so yet, which is another opportunity for people to fight the pipeline. If there's no compressor station, there's no Atlantic Coast Pipeline. If Buckingham County stands up and says, we're not going to let this happen to this community, they can stop the compressor station. So all we're asking for is for Ralph Northam to direct the Department of Environmental Quality to adopt the Northam Standard and go back to what he advocated during the campaign, which they are not doing. And the real problem, to get to your question, is the Army Corps is not doing it. So nobody is examining it. What's happening is families like the Terrys are going out and taking pictures and giving them information. As she mentioned, there's many of these streams and creeks that aren't even on the maps.
My last question, obviously you're an attorney, so you got to be a little more careful than I, but I mean, I've covered enough of these. It seems like this whole process is a bit of a scam. I mean, FERC, literally, essentially, they get a budget, but the oil company pays for the majority of the studies. So you have oil companies basically hiring third-party contractors to do the environmental assessments for a lot of pipelines, and gee gosh jolly, the environmental assessments come back, no problem, no risk. This is what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. So FERC basically has its costs covered by the oil companies for a lot of these environmental assessments. It seems, the Delaware River Keepers sued FERC a couple years ago for pipelines, and they said this isn't a regulatory agency, this is a rubber stamp. So broadening it out beyond Virginia, this gentleman said this is a national issue because it's happening everywhere. What could people kind of do to, peacefully fight back? Because it seems like the problem starts at FERC. Yes, states can do something, but federally, during the Trump administration, but even before the Trump administration, the main regulatory body seems to be acting as a rubber stamp.
Well, what I would say is there's long-term strategy and short-term strategy. The long-term strategy is that FERC needs to be reformed, and Tim Kaine has actually introduced legislation. He's going to continue to fight for that, to reform the whole FERC process to address the precise problems that you're talking about. That's a more long-term thing. The short-term problem, which are these two pipelines in Virginia, reconsideration has been requested at FERC. The chances of that are probably not great, but it's still a possibility. But state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, doesn't have to wait for a long-term solution to reforming FERC. They can stop these pipelines now. They can do it under the Clean Water Act, Section 401. They can do it, and Section 401 requires that the state review pipelines to determine whether they comply with the Commonwealth of Virginia own water quality standards, and if Virginia determines that they do not comply, the pipelines cannot be built. So there's politicians around who are trying to say it's a FERC issue, FERC needs to be reformed, and there's nothing the state can do. It's just simply not true. New York just stopped the Constitution pipeline using the exact same process that Virginia could use but is refusing to use so far.
Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.